Welcome to this lecture on franchising. I'm using the video lecture to try to give you more class time to work in your groups for the business model project. And I want to remind you of what's going to be expected for the business model project. The presentation is going to be December 3rd and the 5th. And we're going to be meeting at what is the new Sharp Iron building, the old ABB building. You can click on the link in the slides and you'll get a good MapQuest address. And we're going to need to begin sharply at 12:30, and 3 teams will be presenting each day. Do not come in and say to me, well, can I log into your email or your wireless to download the presentation? I frankly don't know if there's a wireless account over there that we could log into, and it's really poor form to show up to give somebody a presentation and then say, oh, I sent it to myself on my email. Can I log into your wireless? Not a good move. So today's discussion about existing businesses and franchising is interesting because this is what a lot of people in America really do. They buy into a franchise or they buy an existing building. Probably a lot of you will think about doing this at some point. And so because of this, if we were doing this in class, I would start off with a discussion and say, when you buy an existing building, what are you getting? And the answer is, you're getting all those things on the slides, or on the slide. So the next question is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? And the answer is yes, it depends. For the most part, we think of these things as good things. For example, it's good to have employees, it's good to have customers, it's good to have procedures, but there's a possibility that some of the things the business has isn't very good. For example, it may have a location, but not a very good one. It may have a lot of equipment that you're getting when you purchase it, but this equipment may not really be advantageous. For example, if you are buying into a business where there's been a lot of improvements in the past few years in the equipment that the business uses, you may have a piece of equipment that's 2 or 3 generations out of date. And particularly if it's the sort of business where the prices have been falling, it's something where in the owner's mind that equipment's worth a certain amount because that's how much they paid for it, when in fact you could start all over from scratch and get better equipment at a far cheaper price than they paid for it. You get their brand. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Again, it depends. Hard brands are hard to overcome, but by the same token, if you see a basically sound operation that has just driven itself into the ground through a lot of negative issues that have destroyed the brand, but the core of the business is still basically good, well then it's probably a business that you can pick up cheaply and really do something with. So now that we've talked about what you get, then let's talk about what does it take to buy the business. And this is trickier than it would seem to be. The first issue of why it's tricky is, well, how do you find one that's for sale? Obviously, businesses excuse me, may not really want to advertise that they are in fact for sale, because as soon as you do, you begin to scare away your customer base, and your competitors are sure to say, well, you don't want to do business with them because, well, you know, it's for sale and you don't know whether there's going to be service or all these sorts of conversations. So often people are very quiet about when they're trying to sell the business. Some types of businesses, there are trade magazines and people take out ads in the magazines, which isn't all bad because your customers tend not to be aware of that. Sometimes bankers are very aware of what banking customers they have that would be interested in selling their businesses. Our small business developments that are downstairs is sometimes aware of people that are trying to sell their business, particularly if it's a business that hasn't met the existing owner's expectations. Then you can just ask around. Does anybody know if there's a business that might be available, or those sorts of things. And then finally, and this is the one that's kind of funny, if you see a business you really like and you have any indication that maybe at some point the owners, some point in the future, the owners might be interested in selling, it's worthwhile just go up and say to someone, I love your business. You know, if you're ever interested in selling your business, just give me a call. I might be interested. And what's funny is if you've done your homework or you're lucky or whatever, when you have that conversation with the owner, they're going to immediately dismiss it. We love what we're doing. We're not interested in selling the business. And then 3 months later, your phone rings and it's the owner saying, you mentioned a while back that if I was ever interested in selling my business, you might be interested. Well, let's talk about that some, because they may have never thought about selling their business until you plant the seed. So it's worth just asking around. Now, as an aside, I can tell you that I've had numerous people on several occasions tell me that there are a lot of businesses in the Wichita Falls area where the management team is getting, or I should say the management team, the owners are getting close to retirement age, or the people are aware that the owners would like to retire, and they don't have any obvious successor. They don't have any family, or the family that they have isn't interested in the business. And the point is that if you're interested in being a business owner, but you're not interested in starting it from scratch, you might be surprised at the opportunities, even in the Wichita Falls area, that are likely to present themselves over the next several years. So now that you've discussed it with a business owner and they said, I might be willing to sell to you, you get into the due diligence phase. And due diligence is nothing other than an expression that says, what are we really getting for our money? And then in the due diligence phase, there's a couple of questions you really want to figure out. One is, why are they willing to sell it in the first place? Sometimes the answer is obvious. The people are relocating to another area and they need to get rid of the business. They're clearly of retirement age and they're interested in selling the business and stopping working. But it's worth trying to figure this out, because what you don't want to do is buy a business that looks like it's going strong. In reality, it's got serious issues that make its future viability, frankly, pretty questionable. So I have to look down at the slide to get my notes. One of the things you're going to want to do is to get a set of financial statements from the person offering the business for sale. Then you're going to want to have your own accountant go over those financial statements, and you're going to see whether these numbers make any sense. Perhaps to date, accounting has been portrayed as this exact science where there's no interpretation. That's not true. There's a lot of interpretation that is perfectly ethical and legal within the accounting guidelines. And so you have to have an expert figure out these numbers and see whether they make sense and whether they're going to work for you. You need to ask specific and detailed questions. In many cases, it's not up to the owner to have to disclose things to you if you don't ask. And I'll give you a specific example of that in just a minute. In the previous slide, we talked about what do you get when you buy a business, and some of the things that you get, you want to make sure if you buy the business, you're really going to get them. Are your key employees going to stick with you? Are your key customers going to stick with you? Are your key suppliers going to stick with you? And if the answer to any of those questions is no, then maybe you're not buying quite the business that you thought that you were going to be getting. You're going to want to give the facility and the equipment, obviously, a good once over. And then you're also going to want to specifically ask about any potential liabilities, particularly if the business that you're buying is a corporation and you're buying the whole of the corporation. Because let's say that 2 weeks prior to your discussion, a customer slipped on a wet floor, fell, walked out holding their back and saying, "You're going to hear from my lawyer." They're not technically required to disclose that to you, but if you ask specifically about, are there any liabilities, and they say no, then you would have cause to take the previous owners to court. If it's a corporation and someone slipped, tripped, and fell and wanted to sue the business, the fact that it's changed ownerships isn't going to matter. They're suing the corporation because it's a separate legal entity. So you could have bought this corporation and then suddenly go, wow, I had no idea that these things were going on. So at the end of the day, you've got to ask yourself, if I buy this business, can I do as well as the current owners? Do I have to do better than the current owners are doing? Do I think I can do that? Are the current owners going like doing gangbusters, and all I have to do is half of that? Whatever it is, you want to look at their numbers and ask yourself very critically, are they a reasonable estimation of what I'm going to be able to do if I buy into this business? So now we're through the due diligence phase and you are interested. You're ready to go. Now comes the hard part, the price. And the reason that the price is so hard is because when you buy a business, you are often buying not just the business, but a big chunk of the previous owner's heart as well. This is where their kids worked when they were growing up. This is what put them through college. This was their idea. This was the business that almost went under 3 times and they were able to save it. So there is a lot of emotion involved, and you'll see this all the time, tremendous differences in valuation between what the owner wants and what the person buying the business thinks it's worth. So even though we're going to talk about valuation like it's a science, it's really not. There's a lot of art. Here are some of the things that you can do. One is you can do a future value of the cash flow, the existing cash flow. This is a pretty good system, but it's complicated. And basically what you're saying is, well, if I buy your business and you're making this much money a year, present value money, blah, 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 that stuff you learned in your finance class, it ought to be worth this. Another way to do it is to value the assets. This is a relatively unsophisticated way, but one that a lot of folks will want to do. Well, I paid this much for the building and I paid this much for the equipment. And they're going to want to value the tangible assets and say, there you have it. But what we know from the first slide is there are a lot of assets that are intangible. And if you're going to correctly value a business, you ought to be considering them as well. Not many people try to do this. Particularly if it's a successful business, they're not going to want to just value the assets, but you will from time to time see people that will want to do this. Then you have the idea of comparable sales. This is particularly helpful if, say, you're buying a franchise, somebody that's got a franchise operation and it's already up and operating, and so you're just taking over their franchise operation. Because probably in the franchises, they have lots of similar kinds of cells. For example, I know a guy that was looking at buying a UPS store, and that's pretty clean. You go in and say, this is how much this UPS store is making, how much of other UPS stores that are making a similar amount of money sold for. Another very common way is like we talked about in valuing the company for equity stakes, is multiples of the earnings. All right, you're earning $100,000 a year in this business, and I am willing to pay you 3 times that amount, so $300,000 for the business. That's pretty similar to valuing the cash flows. And then sometimes you're in an industry that just has really good shortcuts, heuristics. For example, I'm told that if you are trying to buy an existing bed and breakfast, you can go in and say, well, in this region, you ought to pay about this many thousands of dollars or tens of thousands of dollars per room in the bed and breakfast. Sometimes those things will help you out, but at the end of the day, it's probably going to be hard to come to an agreement on the price. And then the next topic is where we talk about a very particular kind of existing business, and that's called a franchise. I'll start that discussion in a new clip. Be sure and come back with me.